Welcome to Certification Planner. We are an organization that holds certification courses. We've trained more than 10,000 people in our more than 200 courses. We have more than 100 instructors with 5 accreditations, and we're happy to report that we've got a better than 96% success rate in terms of our past participants in our courses becoming certified. We have corporate training, and of course our public classes can also be attended in the classroom or online. And we do offer online self-study as well. We have accreditation with, again, multiple organizations, and we are trusted by multiple customers too. Our client base, as you see, is represented here. Everything from logistics to financial services to telecom services. Suhan Khanna founded the organization to provide training when it comes to certification and to be an advanced or a forward-thinking organization in providing such certification training. He has also developed a veteran planner service, which is an initiative to support transitioning veterans who are moving into the civilian world from the military. We have many happy customers. You see here's just a sample of some of the statements or compliments we've gotten from clients. My name is Paula Shafer. I am a PMP, a certified project manager or project management professional, as certified through the Project Management Institute. I am a freelance consultant and trainer in project management, also in software process improvement, and aspects related to establishing and improving PMOs or project management office type organizations. I'm also adjunct faculty for Granite State College here in New Hampshire. There I teach graduate level courses in project management. And I teach a range of courses from budgeting to procurement and contract management. Today we're here to talk about project balancing planning and execution in change management as it relates to project management or the project environment. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss change management on a project as described in the Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, 6th edition, also called the PMBOK Guide. My assumption is that you are an experienced project manager wanting to know more about the PMP certification exam. My goal is to assist you in preparing to pass that exam. A key assumption that underlies the PMBOK Guide and therefore pervades everything in the PMBOK Guide and is important to passing the PMP exam is that the projects that are being managed are very large projects. By very large, I mean that they are multi-year projects with hundreds of people working on them, and the budget is greater than 10 million. Or suppliers or subcontractors also working for you on this project. The PMBOK Guide does discuss tailoring of processes to accommodate different project needs, but always assume, unless otherwise stated, with exam questions especially, that the project is large. For example, documentation is essential for a large project and you always have it available. So if a question does not overtly state that it's a large project, simply assume that. Now, as with everything in life, projects experience change, and today we'll discuss some of the aspects of change during a project. To do that, let's start first by reviewing the project environment itself. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. Temporary is key to understanding projects. Temporary is different from an operational organization or an operational type of organization, such as a manufacturing plant. A manufacturing plant would be producing products on a daily basis, and therefore we call it repetitive or operational. A project may be started to retool that that manufacturing plant in order to produce a different product or a slightly different product or a new model of a product. So we have a project that is temporary in nature that retools that plant, and then once the retooling project comes to an end, meaning it's, and therefore making it temporary, then the plant goes into its operational aspects. So a project is temporary in nature, and the unique product that would be produced in this instance is the same plant, but it's been retooled, it's been changed in order to produce the new version or the new product or the new model of product. And because projects are temporary in nature, it's very important to understand what work needs to be done in order to complete the project and how much that will cost. That's often a constraint, is your budget, and of course the schedule, when this project needs to come to an end. So our projects are constrained by three major elements: scope, cost, and time, and those all have to be balanced with quality as well. Quality meaning, in the end, does the product or result that's produced meet the expectations of the customer or the user or the client? The wise project manager starts by identifying the stakeholders. The stakeholders are the people who make the decisions, who pay for the project, or who approve certain elements of the project, or perhaps evaluate the completeness of the project. We always begin with the stakeholders, the customers, to understand their needs, because in the end, the stakeholders are the ones who truly identify what's necessary. We may have thought that these stakeholders wanted a space station to live on, but perhaps all they wanted was a ski lodge to stay at during their vacation. So those are very different. There's different budget involved. There's different elements to plan as a part of this. Develop the project management plan is the first process that I wanted to talk about here today. And I want to talk about only the aspects that relate to change. So the plan, once we have identified the stakeholders and what their needs are, then we start asking questions and evaluating and planning the remaining elements, in addition to the scope, the time, the cost, the quality, but also perhaps the resources or the risks. And in particular, what's very important in planning and developing the project management plan are two components that define the change processes themselves, and that is the change management plan and the configuration management plan. The change management plan defines the process of how we will perform the integrated change control itself. So that's the process, how we will do it for our particular project. Projects are unique, therefore our organization that we work within will have its own, may have its own standard process, but it may not quite meet the needs of the project, and we may need to tailor it. So we have our own change management process, or we may simply choose to use our standard process, but we don't always. Projects are unique, and therefore we may need to change our process. And the PMI, again, assumes that we define our own process. It may come from our organizational standard process, it may not, but they will always assume that we've defined our own change management plan. We also have a configuration management plan. That's important. The configuration management plan applies to the product or the deliverables that we are producing in our project. And those deliverables are based on the requirements, and there are items that we define that we are going to keep under control and manage change to them, such as perhaps a design document or a blueprint. If you're developing software, then your software, your code is a configuration item, it's called, and we need to plan change to that. So your configuration management plan identifies the items that will be placed under control and how we will ensure consistency so that in the end our product is operable, or it works, or it meets our customers' needs. Underlying everything in our planning is assumptions. The assumptions, or an assumption, is a factor in the planning process that is considered to be true, real, or certain without proof or documentation. The idea being that we cannot know everything that we need to know in order to plan our project. Some stuff we need to assume. Like, for example, if for these large projects that the PMBOK assumes, we may need hundreds of people working on it. During the planning, we don't have those hundreds of people working. So we assume a certain skill level and a certain time when they'll be available to us, and that we'll be able to hire them within a certain time frame. That's an assumption we make. Then as we get into the project, we begin hiring, and we need to validate that we're able to hire enough people to work on the project, that we're able to, and they're able to come on board with the skill level that we need, that we don't need to train them, for example, those sorts of things. Those are assumptions we make when we are planning the project that later on may not actually come to fruition. Therefore, and that's important, this is important for change, if those assumptions are invalid or don't get validated, then we'll have to change something in the project. Once we have agreed upon certain elements of, I'm sorry, not certain, all the elements of our plan, then that becomes our baseline. And that includes the schedule, the budget, the assumptions, etc. So everything, once it's approved, it becomes a baseline. And the baseline is what we will begin to implement. And as we track our projects, we will compare what happens back to this baseline or agreed upon plan. And if something's different, if we're not meeting the plan, we need to change. So it's very important to have a comparison so that we know, are we making progress? Are we making the right kind of progress? And if not, then we need to adapt or change. When we direct and manage project work, we're producing, as we begin to do work, we are producing deliverables. Basically, work is happening. So results or deliverables are being produced. That's what we call direct and manage project work. That is a process within the PMBOK in the integration knowledge area where project managers focus our efforts. As we're doing that, we're producing work, then progress is happening, and we get that information through our project management information system, and that information is called in the PMBOK work performance data. So work performance data is actually technically an output of direct and manage project work, and that is the raw data that says work was completed or not completed, when it was completed, how much it cost, and various aspects, what resources were applied, etc. An output of direct and manage project work is a change request. That's a natural part of work that's happening, is a change request happens. The change requests may be in the form of corrective action. There's a problem, let's say we're behind schedule and we need to make a change on our project in order to get our project back within schedule. So that a change request is an output of this. Preventive action is another type of change request that happens. Preventive action, it occurs when we identify as a project manager through analysis of our work performance data or work performance information, such as, for example, earned value. We do a look at the trends there, and we find that or realize that if the current trend continues, we might be over budget 2 months from now. So we take action now called preventive action. So where we change aspects of our project so that to prevent us from being over budget 2 months from now. So preventive action is another type of change request that can come about because of direct and managed project work. If the product isn't working, if there are problems or issues with the product that we're producing, the results we're producing, we may need to correct that, which we would call a defect repair. That's another type of change that happens because of directing and managing the project work. Another process in the integration project knowledge area of the PMBOK, or project management body of knowledge, is the monitor and control project work. And that's where we look at the actual project, where we take the work performance data produced by the prior process of direct and manage work, and we evaluate that or compare that to the baseline. We compare our progress to the baseline. The work performance data may include, again, as we said before, may be schedule. We finished something or we did not finish something, or budget, how much it cost us, or resources or quality or risks, all of that progress. We compare that to the baseline plan and we evaluate that, which then becomes the work performance information. So work performance data is compared to the baseline and becomes, in that evaluation, where, and basically the difference is work performance data is we completed a task on a certain date, an example is, and work performance information would be we're behind schedule or we're ahead of schedule. So that the results of the evaluation are the work performance information. Work performance information is an output of the specific monitoring and controlling processes, which, for example, monitor schedule, control budget, control cost. Those processes that are discussed in the PMBOK produce work performance information, which is an input to this process. Tools and techniques of this process are data analysis, for example, where we then evaluate and decide, is this schedule delay significant enough to need change? Do we need to change or not? So data analysis techniques you'll see as a tool technique of controlling project work. And of course, outputs of monitoring and controlling project work are the work performance reports, which is a summary and a consolidation of work performance information and a documentation of it to produce your work performance reports, such as status reports, for example. And change requests. Change requests are outputs also of the monitor and control project work. And the difference, that analysis, that work performance information that I discussed earlier, the differences are called variance. A variance is a quantifiable deviation, departure, or divergence away from a known baseline or expected value. And that variance can be in tasks. Some tasks complete early, some complete late. Resources, their availability, their quantity, their costs. It can be related to risks. Another example of variance is risk variance. Is it positive? Some risks happen, they could be positive risks, such as you assumed in your project plan. Let's say your project is a renovation of a large building, and you assumed that the heating system would need to be replaced. Once you get into the project and you hire a contractor, an HVAC contractor, they look at it and say, well, it just needs to be serviced. It's got another 10 years of useful life. So you assumed you'd have to replace it. You don't have to. You simply need to service it. That saves you money. That's a positive risk that occurred. And of course, negative risks. Again, behind schedule, over budget, something cost more than you estimated, or it took longer than you estimated. Unplanned events also can happen. that are variances from your plan. They can be positive or windfalls, or they can be unforeseen negative events that occur. And then, of course, quality. There can be defect reports or defect failures. I like to emphasize variance because variance can cause change. And most people, at least in my experience, assume that change comes from the user or the customer. The customer changes their mind or has a business need to change something. And that certainly happens. And that causes change, and you need to follow a formal change process. But change can arise from within your organization and within your project as well. And your process needs to accommodate that, or you need to follow your process to accommodate that. You may have simply underestimated cost, for example, and therefore you need to go back and revisit your baseline to communicate that to key stakeholders, and then to identify the response to that change. Perhaps your funder does not have additional funding or cannot apply additional funding to your project, so you need to take some other kind of corrective action or make some other change in order to accommodate the fact that the project was underestimated from a budget perspective. So change can arise from within the project as well as from your customer as well. And your change control process or your change management plan needs to address that as to how we will do it, and then we follow that during our project. Things that can change could be your policies, your project policies and procedures could change. Your need to change. Your project processes may need to change. Your product scope may need to change. Let's say if you are over budget, then perhaps we need to, and you cannot get additional funding, so maybe we will reduce scope. We won't do as much work as we had planned to do in order to stay within budget, for example. So your product scope may need to change. Your project scope, your work may need to change. We'll do less work. The schedule may need to change. The budget itself may need to change. There are all aspects of a project may change, and the point being that we then follow our process to accommodate that change. So a change is a modification to any formally controlled, deliverable, project management plan, component, or project document. A key aspect here, or key concept, is formally controlled. Obviously, we're not going to follow a process of filling out a change request when we're still in planning. We're still discussing with the customer what they want, what they need, how much it's going to cost, what the schedule is, etc. All of those things. When we're still in discussion and we're still planning, then we aren't going to follow this change control process. But once it becomes formally controlled, which for the project plan is once it becomes baselined, or all documents that are produced, once they become baselined or approved or formally approved, then we'll start following our change process. And an organized, systematic approach is helpful in managing change. Without it, there could be chaos on a major project. A smaller project, you don't have to be, as we said before, you can scale back or you can tailor your process so that you don't need as much documentation, and that's important too. You can become overly formal and weigh down your project if you've got too much formality and too much documentation. But again, the PMBOK assumes that you've got a very large project, and if you're not taking steps to control and systematically control change, then you're going to have chaos in your project. An example of that is some years ago when I was doing a software process assessment. I was doing this assessment for a company that was a software supplier to a power company in a large city. And this was a 3-week process, and I was in my hotel over that entire 3 weeks. And one Sunday morning while I was there, I woke up in the newspaper that was at the door of my hotel room had big headlines that there had been a power outage for a suburb in this city overnight. And it turned out that that problem, that power outage, was because of the software. It was a bug in the software that had been produced by the company where I was doing this assessment. And what had happened was a software developer who had been motivated or encouraged by his company to, be proactive and to do whatever the customer needs, had been authorized through their change control process to make a change in a portion of the software, in a particular module in the software. He had pulled this out of their configuration management library and fixed that bug, and saw another bug and thought, well, it's more efficient if I fix that bug while I'm here. So he made a change. He tested that in his simulated environment. It seemed to work. He put it back in the library, and that software was shipped off to the customer. And at midnight on Saturday night, when they installed their upgrade, it took out power for 100,000 households. So that's the kind of chaos I'm referring to, that if you're not managing your change well, then what seems to be insignificant little changes can wreak havoc somewhere in your project, or your product doesn't work in the end. It doesn't interface. It doesn't work quite right. So the process that we're actually here to focus on and talk about in our webinar is perform integrated change control. The inputs to that are listed here. First of all, the project management plan is an input, because change, we look at what should be, and when we're changing, and what do I have to change? And so the project management plan itself is an input, because that may need to change. In particular, as we mentioned before, the change management plan, how we're going to approach this or process this, and the configuration management plan, how are we going to control changes to the items that we are producing, our product. The scope baseline, the schedule baseline, the cost baseline are all inputs here as well. The project documents then that are inputs are listed here as well. The basis of estimates, which is basically how we produce the estimates for our project plan, for our scope baseline, our schedule baseline, and our cost baseline especially, are estimated. So how do we derive those estimates? That's what the basis of the estimates are. And for change, that's used to assess the impact of the change, because we need to follow the same assumptions, use the same assumptions, or maybe change those assumptions as well, or something else related to the estimate. So those are used in change to help us assess the impact of a change. The requirements traceability matrix is a grid that links the product requirements from their origin or their source all the way through to the deliverables that are produced on the project in order to satisfy those requirements. Its purpose is to ensure that each requirement adds value and that all requirements are being fulfilled or delivered in the products that are being produced by the project. For change, this tool can be very helpful in analyzing the impact of a change, because it shows the links between every requirement and the links among the various items or artifacts that have been produced to date. So if a change is approved, or a change is requested, I guess, then in order to analyze that, we look at, okay, what will need to change? If a requirement needs to change, then here's the design element that needs to change. Here's the test cases that need to change, and therefore we can estimate that. And then, of course, anything that's completed or in the future, will that change as well? So it helps us to better understand what the change would mean and what needs to change, and therefore better estimate or assess the impact of that change. The risk report is the sources of the risk, which may, of course, impact a change request as well. So that helps us to analyze the change as well, or the impact of a change. The work performance reports are used to assess changes as well, because that describes what resources have been used, what the cost and the schedule data are to date, and that may show us the earned value or the burn down rate as well. So that can help us to assess the impact of a change. Ubiquitous throughout the project management body of knowledge, or the guide to the PMBOK, are the enterprise environmental factors and the organizational process assets. For change, the enterprise environmental factors that could impact change are legal or laws of a country, let's say, that you're working in. They have certain laws that could impact something you're trying to change. You cannot change certain things, for example. Industry standards also could impact change. We typically do not use this kind of material in this environment for this reason. So industry standards can impact change, what you're allowed and not allowed to do, or what it may cost you because of, let's say, regulatory issues. You may have to get something re-inspected if you make a change to, let's say, your plumbing. It's already been inspected and approved, but you make a change and now you have to go through a re-inspection. So additional cost may be incurred if we make this change. Contracting, if you're contracting, if you're the buyer and you've hired a contractor to do some work and you want to change that work, then how that change gets implemented would have to comply with the change, with the contract change clause as well. And of course, your own organizational governance, what your key stakeholders or your senior management expect in terms of change, or the processes they've established that we may need to follow. So those are examples of potential. There could be others, but those are examples of enterprise environmental factors that impact your change control process or how you implement a change. Your organizational process assets could be your change control procedures that have to be followed, that may have impacted, obviously, your change management plan, but that could be there for you to help you or to provide some additional support for you. Your configuration management knowledge base can help you to assess the impact of change to a product as well. So there's a lot of input. These are the inputs to this process. The tools and techniques for this process are listed here. Expert judgment is a key for technique. You may hire consultants, you may have expertise within your organization on change, on aspects of change, on the industry standards, on legal advice. We said legal could impact your change, so maybe you need a lawyer to look over a contract if you need to change a contract, for example. So expertise may be key, is a tool or technique that may be used. Change control tools may be used. There's a lot of tools in the marketplace that help support configuration management and or change management. They do things like help you to identify and document a change, to decide on whether they can be tools that help to decide whether or not to accept a change, and to track a change through the entire project and its life cycle as well. So tools can be used. Data analysis is a tool or technique that can be used in helping to perform integrated change control. Alternatives analysis is used to assess and decide which changes are accepted, which changes are rejected. We don't have to, just because a change is requested doesn't mean that it needs to get implemented, and some may be rejected. Some may be modified too, as well. And again, in my background, which is software development or IT, it's quite common to modify a change to say, yes, we'll accept that change, but not in this release. It's not going to be in this next upgrade. It'll be in the one after that, for example. So let's postpone it until phase 2 or phase 3. And of course, and that's an example of modifying a change. A cost-benefit analysis is another form of data analysis that is used or is performed or may be performed for integrated change control. And that's basically deciding whether or not a change is worth the cost. It's going to cost us X amount, but what's the benefit to that? Does the cost outweigh the benefit, for example, in making this change? Decision making is also something that occurs. You need to decide whether or not to accept or reject a change, and that can be done through voting. If you've got typically there's a group on a large project, there will be a group of stakeholders, of key stakeholders who are involved in deciding whether or not to accept a change, and that can be done with voting. Simply, is it a majority? And again, set up rules as to who gets to vote, and that sort of thing will be done in your change process. It can be autocratic. Whoever is paying the bills decides whether or not to accept a change. That's quite common in organizations and companies, certainly to do that. And then there can be very formal multi-criteria decision analysis tools. That's usually something like a matrix that provides a systematic, analytical approach to evaluate or prioritize changes. And that's usually based on predefined criteria that may have weights that it's such as a priority. This is a high priority change. In software development, for example, if we often classify defects or changes as critical versus non-critical. Critical means you absolutely cannot put this into production with this defect or this without making this change. It simply will not work. Whereas something can be non-critical. It could be a cosmetic change. It can be less user-friendly, but there's still a workaround. And so that might be a low priority problem or issue, and we might go ahead and not make that change until later, until the next phase or the next release. And then, of course, meetings are ubiquitous throughout projects and project management. And for change, it's quite common to have a CCB meeting, a change control board meeting, to decide on the project, and then and whether or not to accept a change, rather. There's also a lot of meetings that go on to prepare and analyze for changes as well. The change control board is a common technique. It's key stakeholders who can decide and make decisions about whether or not to accept a change. And for large projects, change control boards are quite common technique used to decide whether or not to accept or reject a change. Outputs of the perform integrated change control process are, of course, approved changes. But keep in mind, not all changes are approved, but approved change requests then become inputs into direct and managed work, because now the work that needs to be done is that work that is not only planned, but then that with the accepted change, approved change request as well. So here's what we're doing now. The project management plan updates any previously approved component that was under control could get updated. So the scope baseline could get updated. The project budget baseline, the schedule baseline, any component of the plan that needs to change as a result of whatever happened here would get updated. Keep in mind too, it's important to understand that when a baseline changes, it's only changed from the last baseline, and past performance, the work that's been done or the money that's been spent or the schedule that's been performed does not change. We need to preserve our historical data. So you change the baseline from a certain point forward, and you don't change past performance. Also, another important project document that gets updated is the change log. The change log is a comprehensive list of all changes that were submitted, change requests that were submitted during the project, and their current status. It's easy, if there's on a large project, it's easy for things to fall through the cracks, and so we document everything. And change is no different than issues is quite common too. To to change. So you have a change request, and you want to log it and then make sure it happens. Or did it get rejected? You still want that in the log too, because one of the things that can happen over a multi-year project is a change you can see that a similar change request, or 5 or 6 times, or 5 or 6 people, or 5 or 6 departments, let's say, over time request the same change. And you may have rejected it the first time, but because this is so small, no one wants this, only one organization wants it, so you decide that it's just not that big enough or not that important enough to focus on it, so you reject the change. Well, over time you realize that, oh, there are more organizations that are impacted or want this or desire this or need this, so you may change over time, but you might not realize that if you don't keep a log. So that change log is very important, very useful information. And of course, especially when it's if it gets accepted, then what stage is it in? Where is it at? What's been replanned? Has it been implemented? Has it been fully completed, in which case you can close it out, but you still keep it on the log so you know that that happened. Here's a typical or example, high-level example, let's say, of a change process for a traditional or a PMBOK type of project. And this, first of all, you identify and submit a change request. It gets documented. Typically, most organizations have a form that is completed, a standard form that is used, and the project gets, the change rather gets requested. It's important to screen those requests. Some change requests are simply not necessary, and the sponsor who's paying the bills doesn't want them. So you basically doesn't think they're worthwhile or worth the cost, or the cost benefit analysis says that they aren't. But typically, before you even get to that point, you want to screen them so that your project team isn't inundated with lots of changes that will never get implemented. So screen first. Only the important change requests are going to get to the point of assessing them. You assess the impact. That means evaluating the impact on all the other elements. If you request a change to the schedule, what does that do to the resources, the scope, for example? So you assess the impact of the change on other components or factors in the project. You send that, and maybe there's even an alternatives analysis. We could incorporate this change in 2 or 3 ways, and here's the one perhaps we recommend, but you send that to the package to the change control board to get their approval or choice or disapproval. Maybe they reject it. Assuming that they accept it, then you inform the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, of what was done, and that, of course, what's important is the people who actually have to implement the change, because then they will implement and document that it was done, and you distribute the results or communicate the results widely throughout the project as to what was done and why. Now, again, this is an example or a possible process, but it depends on the project needs. For example, if your customer is not on your CCB, then you add a step in to get their approval. And then if the product being produced is complex also, then you might have levels of change control boards. For example, when a new airplane is being designed, there typically are multiple levels of change control boards. There's one at the very highest level for anything that impacts all of the aircraft that's being the design and the implementation of the aircraft. But there are subsidiary or CCBs below that only focus on one aspect, like the fuselage or the interior or the avionics in the plane, so that the team of people that are working on the fuselage can approve, understand, accept, and change and approve changes to the fuselage, as long as it does not impact any other aspect of the project. If something on changing the fuselage impacts the avionics, then they need to work with the avionics group and go up one level to the overall airplane to get approval there. So you may need multiple levels of CCBs on these large complex projects, which again is what the PMBOK assumes, is you've got a large complex project that you're doing and you're working on that is ordered to, that's the assumption, the underlying assumption, and that's what you assume when you're reading questions on the exam. Is this is a very large project. They believe that documentation is important, and there's always documentation available. So I need to review my change log before I take the next step, for example. So thank you very much for this webinar, and I wish you luck in your journey towards certification.